I never imagined that a simple phone call could turn my life upside down. It was a Tuesday like any other, the kind of day that fades from memory as soon as it ends. I was in the teacher's lounge, buried under a pile of essays to grade, when my phone vibrated insistently at the bottom of my bag. I hesitated for a moment before answering. That unknown number gave me a strange feeling, as if something important was about to happen. I took a deep breath and swiped my finger across the screen. "Hello, this is Helena," I said, trying to sound professional despite the apprehension consuming me. The voice on the other end was deep and formal. "A lawyer," he introduced himself. "Dr. Rodrigo Mendez." My heart raced instantly. Lawyers rarely bring good news, I thought to myself.
"Ms. Helena, I am calling regarding your great-uncle Augusto Ferreira."
Uncle Augusto. The name dropped like a stone into the lake of my memories, creating ripples of nearly forgotten recollections. An eccentric old man, reclusive in his mansion in the countryside. I barely remembered him, just fragments from a childhood visit. A vast garden, a seemingly endless library, and the distant gaze of a man who preferred the company of books to people. The lawyer continued, his voice cutting through my thoughts.
"I am sorry to inform you that Mr. Augusto passed away last week."
I felt a pang of guilt. How many years had it been since I even thought of him? 10, 15. Life had taken its course, and Uncle Augusto had become just a footnote in my family's history. But Dr. Rodrigo wasn't finished.
"There's more, Ms. Helena. Mr. Augusto left a will, and you and your family are the sole heirs to his fortune."
The world seemed to stop for a moment. My hand gripped the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Heirs. Fortune. The words echoed in my mind, but made no sense.
"We're talking about approximately $50 million.
The lawyer's voice sounded distant, as if coming from another world. 50 million. The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was more money than I could imagine, more than I would earn in several lifetimes as a teacher. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might faint right there in the teacher's lounge. I vaguely heard Dr. Rodrigo talking about papers to be signed, about a meeting to discuss the details. I agreed mechanically, my mind still spinning with the news. When I hung up the phone, the silence of the teacher's lounge enveloped me. The essays in front of me, once so important, now seemed insignificant. I looked at my hands, expecting to see some visible change, but they were the same hands as always, with chalk calluses and red ink stains. $50 million. The amount danced in my mind, provocative, frightening. How would I tell Carlos? How would it affect Julia and Lucas? Our modest but comfortable life suddenly seemed on the brink of a radical transformation. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. I grabbed my bag and left the room, leaving the essays forgotten on the table. As I walked down the school corridor, the familiar sounds of students' laughter and conversations seemed to come from another world, a world I wasn't sure I still belonged to. In the parking lot, I sat in the car and stayed there, motionless, for long minutes. The reality of the situation began to settle in, heavy and inescapable. Our life was about to change drastically, and I had no idea if we were ready for it. With trembling hands, I started the car. It was time to go home and tell Carlos. As I drove through the familiar streets of our town, I couldn't help but wonder, Would the money bring the happiness we always dreamed of? Or would it be the beginning of the end of the life we knew? The way back home never seemed so long. My thoughts were a whirlwind, and several times I found myself driving on autopilot, almost missing the turn to our street. When I finally parked in the garage, I sat there, motionless, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. How would I tell Carlos? The words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the situation. I entered the house, the familiar smell of coffee greeting me. Carlos was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. His routine after work at the bank, so common, now seemed to belong to another life.
Helena, are you okay?
The concern in his voice brought me back to reality. I realized I was standing at the kitchen entrance, my expression probably a mix of shock and confusion. Carlos, we need to talk. We sat at the kitchen table, dinner forgotten on the stove. The words stumbled out as I recounted the call, about Uncle Augusto, about the inheritance. Carlos looked at me with a mix of disbelief and astonishment.
50 million. This changes everything.
The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken possibilities and fears. Carlos stood up abruptly, going to the window. I watched his tense back, the rigid posture he always adopted when processing something difficult. "What will we do?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely small in the silent kitchen. Carlos turned, his eyes meeting mine. I saw in them a glint I didn't immediately recognize. Excitement? Fear? Perhaps both.
We need to think carefully. It's too big to decide anything right now.
I agreed, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in, heavy and inescapable. "And the kids?" I asked, thinking of Julia and Lucas. "How will we tell them?" Carlos ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew well.
At dinner. We'll tell them at dinner tomorrow. We need time to process this first.
I nodded, grateful for the suggestion. The idea of keeping this secret, even for a day, seemed both a burden and a relief. That night, lying in bed, sleep wouldn't come. Beside me, Carlos also tossed and turned restlessly. The future, once so predictable, now seemed like a vast unknown ocean. And we were about to dive into it, ready or not. The next day dragged on as if it had 100 hours. At school, I could barely concentrate on the classes. My students noticed my distraction, but attributed it to a possible illness. If they only knew. At home, I prepared dinner mechanically. Lasagna, Luca's favorite dish, an unconscious attempt to soften the impact of the news to come. Julia arrived first, complaining about a professor at college. Lucas appeared shortly after, headphones firmly in place, as always. The scene was so familiar, so normal, that for a moment I wondered if the call the day before had been a dream. Carlos arrived promptly at 7, as always. Our eyes met. A silent conversation passing between us. It was time. Carlos began, his voice graver than usual.
Guys, your mother and I have something important to tell you.
The silence that followed was heavy. Julia put down her fork, her eyes wide with concern. Lucas removed his headphones, a rare occurrence during meals. I took a deep breath and began to tell them. About Uncle Augusto, about the inheritance, About the 50 million. The reaction was immediate and intense. Julia let out a high-pitched scream, her eyes shining with excitement.
50 million. My God, we're rich.
Lucas, on the other hand, frowned, his gaze shifting between me and Carlos.
Is this serious? It's not some kind of joke, is it?
It's true, son. But this doesn't change who we are as a family.
It changes everything. We can move houses, travel. Why?
Calm down. We need to think carefully before doing anything. Lucas remained silent, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I knew that expression well. It was the same one I saw in the mirror since yesterday. The rest of the dinner was a blur of questions, exclamations, and improvised plans. Julia talked non-stop about trips and shopping. Lucas, quiet, just watched, as if he were watching a strange movie. Later, after the kids went to their rooms, Carlos and I sat in the living room, exhausted.
Well, it went more or less as we expected.
I nodded, thoughtful. The so different reactions of Julia and Lucas were a harbinger of what was to come. Our family was about to embark on an unknown journey, and I wasn't sure if we were ready for it. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking. The money was already changing our family dynamics, and it wasn't even in our hands yet. What would happen when we actually had it? The future, once so predictable, now seemed like a maze of possibilities and pitfalls, and we were about to enter it, together, for better or for worse. The days following the news of the inheritance were like a feverish dream. The routine continued, but everything seemed different, as if the world had changed color overnight. I found myself daydreaming during classes, imagining a life without the worries that had always accompanied us. No debts, no overdue bills, no need to work overtime. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of a trip to Europe, something that always seemed unattainable. Carlos, on the other hand, dove headfirst into a new world. He spent hours in front of the computer, researching investments, stocks, real estate funds. "We need to make this money work for us," he said, his eyes shining with an intensity I had never seen before. Julia embraced the change with a frightening enthusiasm. In just a week, she had already made a shopping list that would make any celebrity blush. Designer clothes, the latest electronics, even a sports car. "But Mom, now we can," she argued every time I tried to curb her enthusiasm. Lucas, my quiet and introspective Lucas, withdrew even more. He barely left his room, except for classes. When I tried to talk to him about the inheritance, he would change the subject or simply leave the room. His distrust was palpable, as if he expected someone to shout, "Gotcha!" at any moment, and everything would return to normal. One night, I found Carlos still awake, his eyes red, fixed on the computer screen.
Don't you see? If we invest right, we can double this money in a few years.
At that moment, I felt a chill. The man in front of me didn't seem like my husband, the mathematician passionate about old books. He was a stranger, obsessed with numbers and percentages. The next day, Julia came home loaded with bags. The gleam in her eyes was pure euphoria.
Look, Mom, I found the perfect bag to match that dress I've always wanted.
I tried to smile, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. Where was my daughter, who dreamed of changing the world? Were a few more zeros in the bank account enough to change a person so much? Lucas passed by us without saying a word, headphones firmly in place, a barrier against the world. I wanted to call him, hug him, tell him everything would be okay, but the words got stuck in my throat. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if we had made a mistake by telling them about the inheritance so soon. The money wasn't even in our hands yet, and it was already causing profound changes in our family. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the dark thoughts. Tomorrow would be another day. Tomorrow, perhaps, we would find a balance. But an insistent voice in the back of my mind whispered, what if things never go back to normal? Time is a funny thing. A month can pass in the blink of an eye or drag on like an eternity. This past month has been both at the same time, a whirlwind of changes and a slow transformation of our reality. Today, I handed in my resignation letter to the school principal. Her eyebrows raised in surprise as I explained my plans to travel the world. But Helena, you love teaching, she said, confused. I also wondered if I was still the same person who a month ago loved being in the classroom. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I replied, the words sounding strange in my mouth. I've always dreamed of seeing other places, other cultures. I didn't mention the inheritance, of course, but as I spoke, images of exotic beaches and historic cities danced in my mind. Wasn't that what I wanted? At home, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. Carlos barely left the makeshift office in the dining room. Piles of papers, charts, and financial reports covered every surface. When I tried to talk about my travel plans, he just mumbled something about maximizing returns and went back to typing furiously on the laptop. Carlos, I insisted, did you hear what I said? I'm thinking of going to Greece next month. He finally looked at me, his eyes red with fatigue.
Not now, Helena. I'm about to close an important deal. Can we talk about this later?
I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. When was the last time we really talked? The sound of high heels clicking on the floor announced Julia's arrival. She entered like a whirlwind, all dressed up, smelling of expensive perfume.
Mom, don't wait for me for dinner. I have a super important event tonight.
And college? I asked, already knowing the answer. Julia rolled her eyes.
Oh, Mom, we've talked about this. College can wait. I'm building important connections.
Before I could argue, she was already gone, leaving behind only the echo of her laughter and the scent of perfume. I sighed, feeling the weight of the silence in the house. That's when I noticed Lucas standing at the kitchen door, watching me with an expression that mixed sadness and anger. Lucas, I began, trying to smile. It's good to see you. Want to have dinner with me? He shook his head.
No thanks. I just came to grab something to eat in my room.
Son, your dad and I were thinking, how about we move to a bigger house? Maybe in a better neighborhood, near that private school that...
No, I don't want to move house. I don't want to change schools. I don't want any of that.
But Lucas, think of the opportunities.
Opportunities? Look around you, Mom. Dad's become a robot obsessed with money. Julie abandoned everything she fought for. And you don't even seem like yourself anymore.
His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wanted to argue, to say he was exaggerating, but the words wouldn't come. Lucas grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl and turned to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked at me one last time.
You know what's ironic? You always said money doesn't bring happiness. I guess you were right after all.
I stood there, frozen in the kitchen, Lucas' words echoing in my mind. I looked around at the house that had always been our home, now seeming strangely empty, despite all the material abundance. What were we doing? In just a month, we had turned into people we barely recognized. And the worst part, we hadn't even realized it until now. That night, lying in bed with Carlos snoring beside me, I wondered if there was still time to fix the damage, or if, as Lucas seemed to believe, we had already gone too far. The tension in our house was palpable, like a taut rope about to snap. Each day brought new conflicts, silent or explosive, that threatened to dismantle the fragile balance we were trying to maintain. Carlos and I barely recognized each other anymore. Our conversations, once full of affection and complicity, now revolved around discussions about money, investments, and the family's material future. I tried several times to address the change in our values, the importance we used to place on the little things in life. But Carlos seemed obsessed with ensuring our financial security at any cost. Meanwhile, Julia was diving deeper into a world that gave me chills. Her new friendships seemed opportunistic, drawn by the allure of newfound wealth. She spent her nights at extravagant parties, coming home with glazed eyes and stories that left me with a heavy heart. I tried to talk, to express my concern, but she dismissed my words as outdated and out of touch. The most worrying, however, was Lucas. My youngest son, once so lively and communicative, now spent most of his time locked in his room. The few times I saw him, I noticed deep circles under his eyes and an expression of constant apprehension. His grades at school, once exemplary, began to slip. I tried to reach out, to offer help, but he closed up like an oyster. One night, passing by the hallway, I heard muffled sobs coming from his room. I stopped, heartbroken, wanting to go in and hug him, to say everything would be okay. But the truth was, I no longer believed that myself. That night, lying in bed while Carlos worked late once again, I wondered how we had reached this point. The inheritance that should have been a blessing seemed to have turned into a curse, eroding the bonds that held us together. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of unshed tears. Something needed to change, and quickly, before we lost each other and ourselves completely. The hotel ballroom sparkled with the reflection of hundreds of crystal glasses and the elegant murmur of conversations. It was Carlos Company's annual gala dinner, an event that used to fill us with pride. Now, as I adjusted my silk dress, I felt only a knot in my stomach. Carlos was speaking on stage, his voice echoing through the microphone. He talked about success, impressive numbers, a bright future, but his eyes were dull, lacking the sparkle that once captivated me. Julia, beside me, was incessantly fiddling with her phone, clearly bored. Lucas, pale in his ill-fitting suit, stared intently at his untouched plate. That's when I noticed Ricardo, Julia's new friend, approaching our table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned in, whispering something in her ear. I saw my daughter's face turn pale. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. Julia stood up abruptly, knocking over her glass.
Nothing that concerns you, Mom.
But her hands were trembling. Carlos, having finished his speech, joined us at that moment.
What happened?
He asked, looking from Julia to me. It was as if a dam had burst. All the tensions, the unspoken words, the resentments of the past months exploded at once. Accusations flew about money, about neglect, about hidden secrets. Lucas, surprisingly, raised his voice, revealing his silent struggle with anxiety and depression. Julia, through tears of anger, confessed to astronomical gambling debts. The people around us stared, shocked, but at that moment, we couldn't stop. It was as if we were finally seeing each other, truly seeing each other, for the first time in months. When the silence finally fell, heavy and suffocating, I looked at my family. We were breathless, with flushed faces and tear-filled eyes. The realization hit us like a punch. We were falling apart, losing everything that truly mattered. That night, we returned home in separate cars, the silence deafening. The mansion, once a symbol of our success, now felt like a gilded prison. As I watched the city lights from the bedroom window, a certainty formed. Something needed to change, or we would lose each other forever. The silence in the mansion was deafening. Days had passed since the disastrous gala dinner, and each of us seemed to be dealing with the consequences in our own way. I spent hours in my old office, now covered in dust, leafing through abandoned projects and forgotten awards. The decision to leave my career, which once seemed so noble and altruistic, now haunted me. I felt a deep emptiness, a loss of purpose that no amount of money could fill. I found myself imagining what it would have been like if I had continued, if I had maintained my independence. Perhaps, I thought bitterly, I would have been able to see the signs of our family's disintegration sooner. Carlos wasn't home. 2 days ago, he had collapsed during an important meeting. Extreme stress, the doctor said. Now, he was hospitalized, surrounded by machines monitoring his fragile heart. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the relentless pursuit of financial security, he had put the most precious asset at risk, his health. Julia returned home the previous night, her eyes red and swollen. Her friend Ricardo and the entire social circle she valued so much had disappeared. She was devastated, finally realizing the superficiality of those relationships. I heard her muffled sobs coming from her room, but I didn't know how to comfort her. The chasm between us seemed insurmountable. It was Lucas who finally broke the ice. One afternoon, he entered the room where I was, carrying a dusty box. Inside were old photos, memories of simpler times. With a trembling but determined voice, he began to speak.
Look at this, Mom. Who are these people? Because I don't recognize any of us anymore.
He said, showing a photo of the 4 of us smiling in front of our old house. His words hit me like a slap. Lucas continued, pouring out how he felt lost, suffocated by expectations and the sudden change in our lives. He talked about the pressure to maintain appearances, about how he missed the relaxed conversations at dinner, the genuine laughter. He concluded with a maturity that surprised me.
We've lost our identity. All this money, for what? Look what it's done to us.
I remained silent, tears streaming freely. Lucas was right. At some point, we had lost ourselves in the pursuit of something we thought would bring us happiness, but that only brought emptiness and distance. That night, lying in the king-size bed that suddenly felt too big, I made a decision. We couldn't continue like this. It was time to face our choices, our losses, and perhaps find a way back to ourselves and to each other. Dr. Oliveira's office was welcoming, with its softly coloured walls and comfortable chairs. Yet, sitting side by side, we felt out of place, like mismatched puzzle pieces forced to fit together. "So why are you here?" the therapist asked, her gentle gaze sweeping over each of us. The silence that followed was deafening. Who would be the first to speak? Who would have the courage to expose our wounds? Surprisingly, it was Carlos who took the initiative. His voice, usually firm and authoritative, sounded tired.
We've lost our way. I've lost my way.
That admission opened the floodgates. Words began to flow, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in muffled cries. We talked about unmet expectations, about loneliness amidst abundance, about the crushing weight of appearances. Julia cried as she confessed she felt like a failure, unable to find her place in the world. Lucas, with his eyes fixed on the floor, spoke about the pressure of being the perfect son and how it suffocated him. When it was my turn, I felt a lump in my throat. I don't know who I am anymore, I admitted, tears streaming freely. I thought I was doing the best for everyone, but Dr. Oliveira guided us patiently, helping us untangle the web of emotions and resentments. By the end of the session, we were exhausted, but there was a spark of something new in the air. Hope, perhaps? In the weeks that followed, each of us embarked on a journey of self-discovery. Carlos drastically reduced his workload, focusing on his health and reconnecting with his original passion for engineering. He began spending more time at home, trying, awkwardly at first, to rebuild bridges with the children. Julia, after much reflection, decided to return to college. She chose psychology, determined to better understand herself and perhaps help others in the future. Her nights were now spent studying, not at empty parties. Lucas, with our support, began exploring his passion for photography. His photos, capturing simple everyday moments, reminded us of the beauty we had forgotten to appreciate. As for me, I decided to resume my career, but on my own terms. I started working on social architecture projects, seeking a balance between professional fulfillment and family time. Our attempts at reconnection were sometimes awkward, sometimes painful. There were moments of frustration, of relapses into old patterns, but there were also moments of unexpected tenderness, a spontaneous hug from Julia, a sincere conversation with Lucas about his fears, a look of understanding exchanged with Carlos. One night, sitting at the dinner table, something we hadn't done together in months, I realized we were truly talking. Not about business or appearances, but about our days, our dreams, our fears. We laughed at a silly joke from Lucas, and the sound seemed to fill the house in a way that silence never could. I looked at my family, and for the first time in a long time, felt a genuine glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but at least now we were walking it together, seeking a balance that could sustain us through life's storms. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of my new office. It was smaller, simpler than the previous one, but every object there had a purpose, a story. I smiled at the framed drawing Lucas had made, an abstract representation of our family, united by colourful lines. My desk was covered with plants and projects, but they weren't luxurious mansions or towering skyscrapers. They were social housing projects, community daycare centres, public spaces that could transform lives. The phone rang. It was Carlos. "Just called to wish you a good day," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness I had almost forgotten. Carlos had surprised us all with his transformation. He still worked hard, but now he knew when to stop. His evenings and weekends were sacred, dedicated to family. He had rediscovered his passion for engineering, focusing on sustainable projects that combined innovation with social responsibility. Julia. My heart swelled with pride at the thought of her. Her decision to return to college wasn't easy, but she faced the challenge with a determination I had never seen before. Psychology was her new path, and she approached each class, each book, with a thirst for knowledge that went beyond grades. "I want to understand people, Mum," she told me once, "not just judge by appearances." And Lucas, my Lucas, he had found his voice through the lens of a camera and service to others. His photographs, displayed in local galleries, captured the beauty and dignity of people in vulnerable situations. But it was his volunteer work in shelters and community centres that truly transformed him. He came home exhausted, but with eyes shining, full of stories and ideas. Our house, though still spacious, was no longer a museum of ostentation. We had donated much, simplified our lives. Each room now reflected our personalities, our journeys. The dining room, once the stage for formal and tense dinners, was now the heart of the house. There, we shared not just meals, but dreams, fears, achievements. Sometimes, looking back, I barely recognized the family we used to be. The money we thought was the solution to everything almost became our downfall, but it was also the catalyst for our transformation. Sitting in the garden, watching the sunset, I reflect on our journey. That phone call, almost 2 years ago, didn't just bring an unexpected fortune, but a profound test for our family. We went through moments of blind euphoria, through crises that threatened to tear us apart, through painful revelations about ourselves. We almost lost our way, seduced by the allure of luxury and appearances. Each of us, in our own way, drifted away from who we truly were, trying to fill voids with things that, in the end, had no real value. But in the midst of chaos, we found strength in each other. We learned the hard way that true value isn't in a bank account, but in the bonds that unite us. Wealth gave us options, it's true. It opened doors that once seemed closed. But it was our choices, especially after hitting rock bottom, that defined who we truly are. Today, I look at my family and see people different from those who received that news 2 years ago. I see individuals who are stronger, more aware, more connected. Carlos learned that success isn't measured only by numbers. Julia discovered that her voice and ideas have value. Lucas found a purpose that goes beyond himself. And me? I learned that my identity isn't tied to a title or a bank account. It's in the choices I make every day, in the impact I can have on others' lives, in the love I give and receive. We realized that wealth isn't in the zeros of a bank account. It's in the carefree laughter during a family dinner. It's in the tight hug after a hard day. It's in the satisfaction of making a difference, even if small, in the world around us. We're not perfect. We still have tough days, arguments, moments of doubt. But now we face these challenges together, with a deeper understanding of who we are and what truly matters.
Hey there, Unraveling Ties family. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I hope it touched your heart, made you think, or even inspired you in some way. We would love to hear your thoughts and feelings about this story. Don't be shy. Leave a comment below and share your perspective with our community. Your voice matters to us. If you enjoyed today's story and want to be a part of our journey as we unravel the complexities of human relationships, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a new story. We're always eager to explore new angles and dive into the themes that resonate with you the most. So tell us, what kind of stories would you like to see in upcoming episodes? Your input helps us create content that you'll love. And hey, if today's story reminded you of a personal experience or a tale you'd like to share, we're all ears. Feel free to share your own stories in the comments. Who knows, your story might even inspire a future Unraveling Ties episode. Once again, thank you for being a part of the Unraveling Ties family. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Until next time, keep embracing the ties that bind us and never stop exploring the depths of the human heart. See you in the next video.